I'm John Uldrich, this is Uldrich-Carney, and we are announcing today at 10:07 in this august building that we are mounting a write-in campaign as unendorsed Republicans. The reasons for running is that, number one, we both ran earlier in respective primaries, Bob in the Republican primary and I in the Independence primary. And we came out of there obviously not as winners, but we came out dedicated to the cause that, number one, Minnesota deserves at least another option on the table of the three current candidates. And we believe that our combined skills, aptitudes, ideas, and beliefs will bring to the state of Minnesota a much improved government team, governor and lieutenant governor. To that end, in that the focus of the campaign has now arrived at budget, and budget, we have developed just such a budget. And this is one of the reasons why Bob Carney is a very strong candidate as lieutenant governor. And he basically has a strong handle, a big handle, if you will, on budgetary processes in the state of Minnesota, and also the legislative process that goes along with finding a means to handle a problem that is currently close to $6 billion in size, and if you factor in the issue of inflation, it is over $6 billion. And so, because that's our primary focus, but there are others, I'm going to ask Bob to talk about the budget, and we'll get into a Q&A situation here when it's appropriate. Bob?
We've got a handout on this, and I'll go over this briefly. The overview is that we need to have some new revenue, but we're taking the approach of using, in effect, temporary tax increases that are targeted to sunset mostly in 2 years and some in 4 years. This is the same approach that Governor Al Quie took during the very deep Carter-Reagan recession. And those tax increases did sunset, so we're planning on half of the shortfall being made up by these sunset tax increases, and that's mostly by going back to the 1998 rate for the income tax, with an additional 0.5% for the highest rate. There's a few areas where we would increase the sales tax base. The rate won't change, but again, those things are sunsetted. Then we've got some increases in corporate, general property tax, and liquor and cigarettes. The idea is that we are in a recession, and everybody has to share the pain in the short term. 1/4 of the budget, and that's on page 2, involves cuts. And most of these are based on the original unallotments that were held to be unlawful by the Supreme Court last May. But these have been approved by the legislature in the special session omnibus bill. And we have enough detail and enough background experience on them where this is a tangible dollar amount for each of the categories. Some of the cuts are taken directly out of Senator Dayton's plans. We think that some of these things add up and make sense, but we have serious questions about Dayton's budget overall. We believe that it's still significantly out of balance. He can't raise even half of what he talked about in the $4 billion on tax the rich. So there's still a significant issue there. We're also saying that we think we can get an additional $500 million in savings on health and human services. Part of that is because the overall increase rate projected on that is extraordinarily high, 30% from the previous biennium. And in addition, we're in favor of the early opt-in for general assistance, Medicare, and medical assistance. And because of that, there's going to be about $1.4 billion in additional money coming in from the federal government. So we think that the legislature can come up with an additional $500 million in cuts there. Those together add up to a balanced budget.
Thanks, Bob. I talked very briefly about Bob's credentials. I don't want to shortchange myself, and that's the reason for the caps that are out here. And this is not the same cap I'm wearing here. but this cap is now brand new, and this cap was about, if it were still around, probably be 30 years old when this picture was taken. And again, I did catch the fish. I was the young CEO of Vexillar, and it's a fun story to tell, and I'm sure that Wendy would laugh when he heard the full story. But he and I were there together along with Vice President Mondale. Governor's Fishing opener on Grandview umpteen years ago. The reason I have the hats out here, number one is I am the only candidate in the race that has a military background. That includes VA work and the Marine Corps. The other cap represents general aviation, which is a big issue in Minnesota, and one that I would work to foster. This cap is probably less known, but it's probably one of the more important caps that I wear. This is Nakama. This is the Jewish relief group. And if I weren't here today doing this, I would be down in either Owatonna or one of the other cities mucking out basements. And joined this group as a volunteer, started with them in the post-Katrina era. And then of course Vexillar, and on Vexillar we get back to the campaign. Of the three governor candidates, my belief is that the jobs that I have created in the state of Minnesota, starting with Vexillar in 1960, and jobs and businesses up on the range in southern Minnesota and Minneapolis, is that if you took all the jobs that they've created and put them in a paper bag, you probably wouldn't have enough jobs to powder a donut. But the number of jobs that I've created over the years basically is in the thousands. And that's one of the things that Minnesota basically needs to have done is economic development. Bob talked about some of the things we fault Dayton on, and that he would take out the Minnesota Trade Office completely. We, in fact, would find this to be one of the groups that we would actually find money to expand, including the possibility that we would extend a welcome hand to the Minnesota Film Board to provide them some operating muscle to continue, because we think that creating films in Minnesota is good money, and it brings a lot of credibility to the state, as well as jobs, and there are possibilities of long-term benefits flowing to a state. The bridges of Madison County, for example, the Field of Dreams, and we believe that there are films out there that have the same potential and can help Minnesota. I'm going to go back to Bob for just a moment, and I'm going to have him explain one of the haircuts, which is the people in Minnesota who make out of government coffers over $300,000, and Bob will give you a specific look at how that might work.
Thanks, John. This is actually out of Dayton's budget. He's identified about 302 people that work for Minnesota State colleges and universities that are paid more than the governor. He's saying that there should be a 5% cut on that. We ran the numbers, and the average pay there is $300,000 per person. So we're talking about a 20% haircut. That would save $40 million instead of $10 million. One other point on the budget as to how we're approaching this. We believe that it is fundamentally unjust to have the public sector having increases in pay and benefits and more job security when we have, in effect, a private sector depression going on. And so we're trying to buy time with these temporary tax cuts for 2 years. But our goal is to have across-the-board cuts in compensation and benefits. And the goal is to have the same number of people, to not cut jobs and to not cut services, but to cut the pay so that it'll match what's going on in the private sector. That's how we plan to get this budget situation in balance. We don't want to cut people, and we don't want to cut jobs. We want to cut the pay instead so we can have the same services for less.
We're going to stay on the subject of cuts, but we're going to call them haircuts. I obviously don't need a haircut. Bob needs a trim job once in a while. But we're going to talk specifically about the haircuts that the governor, the lieutenant governor, are going to take and that we're going to ask all other parties in state government who have salaries over $100,000 to take an immediate 20% cut. There will be sunset stipulations for these, but it's not only good faith based on Bob's comments about the public sector and the private sector being in relationship. We think that these cuts are advisable. Those cuts will go down both in terms of percentage and they will go down in terms of public sector income, and there will be 15% cuts, there will be 10% cuts, and at the lowest end there will be 5% cuts. In addition to the budget, there are some areas that this governor and lieutenant governor are going to work very hard to get a handle on and understand exactly what the situation is. One is our $52 billion pension program. What state is it in? What moves have to be made now in order to provide pensions when the people who have paid money into them expect to get those benefits out? We will also be looking at the investment management team of Minnesota's investments, and we'll try to determine whether that can be done better and more profitably. We'll be looking at bond status, and we will be looking at developing a internship program that will serve to provide paid internships to a larger number of people with some benefits, and we'll use the University of Minnesota model of shared jobs to create jobs at a time when there's going to have to be a job freeze, and we'll be also looking at early buyout if that is economically feasible. That's our overview. We're open to questions and answers.
Realistically, what do you think your chances are having a write-in campaign?
Realistically, I think that because we have the assets to create advertising and run advertising on media, and we can use the internet, and we've demonstrated in our own campaigns that the internet is a very viable force. But I think the most important issue here, and Bob and I are in agreement in this, and that is there's a roiling world of Minnesotans out there who are dissatisfied with the choices they're being given, dissatisfied with the answers that they get when they push on issues, and we are being very specific. And yes, we're being hard-nosed because these are the best or the worst of times, depending how you look at it, and they have to be dealt with, and everybody has to participate. And we don't hear that coming from the other people. I didn't mention, but I will do this, I'm a big football fan and love the Vikings. I love college football, but one of the issues is the Viking Stadium, and we're at a point in time where state money cannot be allocated to a brand new stadium. I will, however, be a cheerleader. Bob will join me in this, in trying to determine if there are ways to accomplish this job, but not at the expense of the Minnesota taxpayer.